So now we're going to do the if function. The if function is really useful for what it does, but it has a very small usefulness, a kind of a niche spot. It's used for translation. Now, we're used to seeing this kind of stuff with a bunch of trues and falses, but that's very geeky and it's hard to read. A column full of, with one true in it and a bunch of falses, it's hard to spot the true. It'd be nice to be able to take the true and the false and translate them into something that's more oriented toward human thinking. So what we're going to use is the if statement to translate a true and a false into English words and just make our spreadsheets easier to grasp. Now, we have a question. Is actual hours more than 40? It's a simple logical question. Is actual hours more than 40? And I can write that very easily. So let's go back to the worksheet here in column L, and we're just going to say, is actual hours greater than 40? That the rule is if you're paid more than 40 hours in a week, then it has to be time and a half as overtime. So let's look at actual hours. E2 greater than 40. Now this is just a simple logical statement, and we're going to get trues and falses out of this. So here's a false, and then there's a true and true. But what we want to do is, when it is over 40, I want it to not display the word true. I want to display the word overtime. And if it's false, then I want to display the word regular. So what I have to do is take the trues and falses and do a translation. I've got my logical expression here working, so now I'm going to type the if statement and wrap it around it. If. Now the first argument is the logical test, meaning that we're asking a yes/no question. Is it greater than 40? So that's our first argument. We're asking, is the result, is the actual hours greater than 40? Now, if it is true, then we're going to put in the second argument what we want to display instead of true. And I'm going to say overtime. So that's the value if true argument. Then we'll specify the third argument, which is the value if false. And that will be regular. So, we're asking the question, is E2 greater than 40? If it is, instead of displaying true, we'll display the word overtime. And if it isn't, instead of displaying the word false, we'll display the word regular. So it's translating the true and the false into our English words like overtime and regular. So, now it makes it much easier to spot overtime in the column because we're translating it into simple words. So, that's the basic use of the if function. Now, there is a little more complicated use. Well, here, let's go back through the foils before I do that. Start out simply with just the question, is it more than 40? We have a logical expression that we made sure produced true and false properly, and then we just wrap the if statement around it. Now, let's look at a more complex example of an if statement. And again, I'll build this out step by step. What we're saying is assign Jerry to the north work group, and assign Samantha to east. So we want the word Samantha showing up in these rows here, or these rows where it says east. And then for Phil, for everything else, will be west. So we'll have Samantha here in these first 4 rows where it says east, and we'll have Jerry for the north. So let's write a simple if statement and just take care of the Jerry part. So I'll say equals if. Then I look at the work group over here, and I'll say, is the work group equal to north? If it is, then I'll display Jerry. Otherwise, I'm just going to, for the moment, display a question mark, just so I can get Jerry working first. Okay? Let's take our if statement. If A2 equals north, if that's true, then we'll display the word Jerry. Otherwise, we'll display a question mark. So let's propagate it. And it worked. We got Jerry here. Okay, but only in the north work group, so we have Jerry here. Now we have to go back and deal with Samantha and with Phil. So now, let's look at this if statement. If it's north, then we do Jerry. However, if it's not, then we'll run another if statement in the false part. So I'm putting this if statement in the false part. I'm embedding an if statement inside of another if statement. That's called nesting statements. I'm nesting one if statement inside of another. Now I'll say if A2 equals Samantha, A2 equals Samantha, then, if A2 equals East, then I want to display Samantha, S-A-M-A-N-T-H-A. Otherwise, I want to display Phil. And I need a closing right parenthesis. Let's propagate it, see if it works, and then we'll come back and examine it. So, it works. I've got Samantha showing up for the East work groups. I've got Jerry showing up for the North work groups, and I've got Phil showing up for everything else. So let's go back and see how this works. So, if A6 is North, then we display Jerry. If not, we go on to the nested if statement and check A6 equals East. If it's true, then we display Samantha, and if it's false, then we display Phil for anything else. So that's how you can use a nested if statement to do a three-way mapping of people into groups, where we're mapping three different groups into three different people here. And that's about as complicated as I'm going to get you with if statements. When it gets to be more than three, if it gets to be 4 or 5, it gets very cumbersome. The if statement will get very long. And if it's 20, it's completely impractical. And there's other ways of doing it in Excel. Now, one other thing I want you to be aware of is these applications here, where I'm using the if statement to translate true and false into something more human-oriented, that's really the only use for an if statement. Let's suppose I had, and let me give an example of how not to use the if statement. Suppose I had a 2 in this cell and a 3 in this cell. I can write a statement that gives me a true-false just by saying, is this cell greater than that cell? And the answer is false, because 2 is not greater than 3. That's the simplest, most concise, easiest to understand, easiest to write way of doing it. Now, what I've noticed students do is write a statement like this. They'll use the if statement instead. If J18 is greater than 19, then true, else false. Now you get exactly the same result, but you do it in a much more complicated way. The only reason you should be using an if statement is if you're going to display something else here besides true or false. So if I wanted to say something like greater or smaller, then that would make sense, because now I'm translating the true and false into something English-like. But unless you're doing translation, this kind of statement will work just fine. So that's it for the if statement.